Hi everybody, good morning. I saw Andy on the way in this morning and we just had a quick check in the middle of the revolving door. I was a bit concerned that he was going to be controversial and then I was going to say something that completely contradicted everything he said, but I'm happy to say it's fine, we're on a par. So good morning. It's a real pleasure to have been invited here today by the lovely people at Iris Connect to speak to you. This is my second time at this event. I'm with you here last year, or if this is your first time, hopefully you'll agree with me by the end of the day that it's a fantastic space for educators to come together, to discuss and collaborate and share expertise that we can all take back to our schools and our organisations to help us to do even better work. And for me, those things are the essential components of all good professional development: dialogue, collaboration, and that shared commitment to continually learning and improving. And I know that those components sit at the very heart of the work that Iris do, and that's why I'm really delighted to be here today and to support that work. So my name is Sam Gibbs, as I've already said several times, and I am currently working at the Greater Manchester Education Trust, where I lead on curriculum and teacher development. And my career in education started with 12 years of full-time teaching English in secondary schools in Leeds and leading English departments. And although I don't get much chance to teach anymore, I do cling on to one or two lessons of Year 11 English in one of our schools every week, and they are that 1 or 2 hours are the highlight of my week, because I think there's literally no job in the world as wonderful as working with young people in the classroom, even though, and I'm speaking for my Year 11s here, they can be very tricky, they can be very cheeky, and they can be very challenging, but they're also curious and funny and hopeful and inspiring. And that's why every child, I think, and I know you'll agree with me, deserves to be taught by a great teacher, one that can inspire them and one that believes in their potential. And we know, of course, the impact that great teachers have on young people. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this report from Chetty that shows that teachers have an impact on young people that goes well beyond the classroom. There is a link between the lifetime earnings of young people and the quality of the teaching they receive. So the impact of a great teacher is well beyond anything else that we can do in schools, especially for disadvantaged pupils. And I'm sure you'll be familiar also with the Sutton Trust report, which shows that the impact of a highly effective teacher is even more significant from those children from disadvantaged backgrounds. They need the best teachers the most, of course. The equivalent being here, as the report says, a whole year's learning for those pupils between a good teacher, I don't like that phrase, a bad teacher, a less effective teacher. They need those teachers the most because the effect on their lives can be transformative, and of course we owe it to those children to get it right. And I know, of course, I'm preaching to the converted here today because you, like me, will passionately believe in teacher education as the priority in the sector right now. Because when we invest in teachers, we're investing in our young people. And so I think I would agree here with John Thompson and Johnny Utley in putting staff first, that improving the quality of teaching in our schools is the single most important challenge facing school leaders, and something that we should all be focused on. But of course, we also know the challenges of the context that we work in at the moment. So recently the Department for Education released some what can only be described as alarming figures about the numbers of teachers that are leaving the profession, as reported in Schools Week here. And we've also got a significant and worrying trend that's become an issue in subjects that were I think previously considered to be quite safe. So my subject is English. The Guardian back in June reported, quote, heads are shocked to find it is now a battle to find teachers of English, traditionally a subject that buoyed recruitment numbers. And at the time of print in June, it stated there were 900 vacancies across England for a September start, which begs the question, of course, why are so many teachers leaving the profession? There are lots of complex reasons for that, of course. We can't talk about them all today, we'll be here forever, but we can't talk about teachers, I don't think, and their development without acknowledging the context that we're in, because it affects the choices we can make in our schools, it affects the resources we have at our disposal, it affects, really importantly, how teachers feel about their work and their careers and how they engage in professional learning. So what we're most interested in, of course, is how we can turn this tide. What can we do about it? How can we keep great teachers in our classrooms? And these two things are intrinsically linked, I think, because if we can solve the retention crisis, we can solve the recruitment crisis as well. And I think we all know that a pay offer, even a significant significantly better one isn't going to be the single fix that we need. It doesn't explain everything about why so many teachers are moving away from the classroom. So I want to focus today on what I think might be a link between keeping teachers in the profession and the sort of CPD experiences that they have. So at the point when I left full-time English teaching, I taught English in secondary schools for a number of years, for 12 years, and sometimes I look back on that now as a kind of golden age, really, of teaching, because I had almost total autonomy over my classroom. And by that I mean I planned all my own lessons from scratch. There was no centralised resource. I had the national curriculum, I had the exam specs, there was nothing there to guide me. Nobody seemed to really pay a great deal of attention to what I was teaching, as long as the results were kind of okay at the end of the day. Most of my lessons came from Teach It or Tess. Everybody remembers Teach It or still uses it, and sometimes it was all right. There was some good stuff on there, although most of it I had to pay for myself, and some of it was absolutely awful, and I cringe when I think back to it now. If anybody here is an English teacher, and I've got one on the front row, and you were teaching around that time, you might remember the sherbet lemon lesson from Teach It. Remember that one? So basically you were trying to get kids to do a piece of creative writing, so they all had a sherbet lemon on the desk, and it was about using the 5 senses. They had to smell the lemon, they had to open it, they had to feel the paper, they had to taste it. You can probably predict what happened in those lessons. From a kind of pedagogical point of view, if they couldn't write creatively before that lesson, they certainly couldn't do it by the end, because there was no explicit vocabulary instruction whatsoever. And then kind of worse, of course, most of the lesson was spent trying to stop them eating the sweet too soon, so they had nothing to actually do for the rest of the lesson. And then afterwards, spending your break time clearing up all the sweet wrappers that they'd thrown around the room. So that way of preparing lessons had obvious drawbacks. I had complete autonomy over what I taught, but I was working 70-hour weeks for a good 4 or 5 years. And despite these lessons being available on these kind of sites, I still had to find them, I still had to create resources. So I had to go to Tesco and buy the bag of sherbet lemons, and I still had to try and make them coherent, which I didn't do very well. And I had no real sense of what a sequence of learning would look like over time, how knowledge and skills built sequentially, how to adapt learning to meet the needs of my classes. I was just planning one lesson to the next. I had autonomy, but I had no structure. And apart from learning from my many mistakes, I didn't really feel I was getting much better at teaching. Now, over time, the system has moved, of course, to greater structure, and in many ways, this is really welcome. So we've got the early career framework, we've got the suite of new MPQs, we've got much better resources now available to teachers, they're better sequenced, they're more coherent. But I do think we need to take great care with how much structure we move towards to avoid some potential unintended consequences. I can clearly remember the point at which I think that lack of structure seemed to be changing. So it was about the end of my third year in teaching, and we were handed in our coursework folders to our head of department, and he said, well, how are you going to make sure these kids here that haven't got their target grades, how are you going to make sure that they get them? And I remember thinking, oh, okay, nobody's ever asked me about that before. That seems strange. Now, to those of you newer to teaching, that might seem like another world, a different world entirely. But at the time, for me, the idea that I was accountable for those grades seemed really quite odd. So for me, the introduction of target grades was a kind of line in the sand. That was the beginning of this kind of era of accountability. And accountability is no bad thing. Of course, we need it, it's necessary. But I think as it ramped up, as it increased, it led to some quite distorted practices in schools. I'd go so far as to say that it became toxic in some schools and potentially still is in some settings. My experience of feedback as a teacher was most often via a sort of Ofsted style performance management system. So once a year, you'd have a really high stakes observation from a member of SLT, usually, often who didn't teach your subject, and you would live or die off that grade all year. So if you were good, you were good. If you're outstanding, well, you could just you were great all year. You could just swan around the place. No, and unfortunately, what that kind of led to was some of those distorted practices, I think. So I had in my top drawer an outstanding English lesson that I would rock out for such occasions as this high stakes observation. So I put the kids into, there weren't actual donuts, I learnt my lesson from the sherbet lemons, there was no more food. Would put kids into groups of 4, they would have like a paper donut that cut up into 4 squares, and then the circle was like the jammy bit in the middle, and they would sit in groups and they would talk about a text and they would write their ideas down on the different squares, and then they would summarise them on the jammy bit at the middle, and it was great because it didn't take me long to prepare. They could apply it to any text, and then I could just swan around the room marvelling at all the great discussions that were going on. And this was the time when you were only meant to talk for 20% of the time in your lesson, so it was absolutely perfect. It worked brilliantly. It got me at least 6 outstanding grades, and 2 of them were from Ofsted inspectors, so it served me really well, that donut. But I didn't come into teaching, of course, to tick performance checklists, and it was always great to pass my appraisal. Oh, brilliant, great, paid an extra £20 a month or whatever, but it said nothing to me about my expertise as a teacher. I knew I was gaming the system essentially, and over the following years we saw lots of changes with these metrics. So changing assessment practices, we've had new specs, inspection frameworks. Unfortunately, I think driving a lot of decision making in schools, and for me at that time in my career, I was kind of falling out of love with it really. A job that I'd sort of seen as my vocation, I became less in love with. And when the last school that I taught full time in joined a large multi-academy trust and they brought in a fully centralised curriculum, for me at that time I felt like I'd reached my end. So I left the classroom for a bit because I felt I had nowhere to go really, and I wasn't getting any better at teaching. And increasingly all the ways that I taught English pretty successfully, I think, were being questioned, and there was kind of pressure on me and my colleagues to teach in ways that I didn't recognise, that didn't feel authentic to my subject, I guess. I remember looking at a set of slides, sort of PowerPoint slides in a shared area of the centralised resource. I was teaching of Mice and Men at the time, and I was looking through and I couldn't see any lessons where we actually read the book. It was all just kind of teaching by extract. But that pressure is real because we were being observed all the time by different people from the trust or kind of within the school. And if there were parts of my lessons where we were just reading, and somebody came in, I was worried that the feedback would be, but they're not making any progress. You're just reading. So that pressure felt real, and I was losing a sense, I think, of the value in what I was doing. So for me, the pendulum had sort of swung too far from autonomy with no structure to all structure and very little room, it felt, for my autonomy. So I took a break from the classroom. I spent 3 years working in teacher education, so I got a job at what was then the Institute for Teaching with Katie, and is now Ambition Institute, and I was really privileged for those 3 years. I got to work with hundreds of teachers, leaders in schools across the country, delivering CPD and coaching, and I saw there, I think, for the first time, how empowered teachers could be when they had access to really good, high quality CPD that was structured, evidence-based, and matched their individual needs and that of their school context. And my greatest joy in that job was to help schools develop teams of coaches, and they could then go on and teach that to others in their schools. It had a kind of filter effect. So when I saw them taking the learning from our programmes and then applying that in their own schools to help improve in the areas that were needed, and when they were supported by leaders in their schools who were invested in that development, that was really, really powerful. And often doing that, I reflected how much better I could have been as a teacher in those 12 years if I'd had that structure, but with that autonomy to use that learning in the way that I saw fit as a professional, and to exercise my own professional judgment to suit the needs of the children in my classes. So to me, that should be the goal of all CPD, to empower teachers to be able to better solve the complex problems of teaching and learning by equipping them with the knowledge and skills to be the best that they can be. But I think the word autonomy has become difficult because sometimes there's an assumption it means we're just letting teachers do whatever they like, and obviously that's not a good thing either. There was recently a blog from David Didow about this, and he landed on this phrase, earned autonomy. So he's taken this from the work of Matthew Evans. And Didow's argument in his blog is the right to autonomy should be earned by teachers as they gain in greater expertise, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it. But what Matthew Evans highlights here, and David puts in his blog, is that the issue with autonomy is it's about individuals, and of course schools are not about individuals. They thrive on the collective efforts of a whole community. So I think autonomy and structure are a kind of false dichotomy. We like those, don't we, in education? It's neither about just letting teachers do what they like, but neither is it about controlling their every move. I think it's probably more about agency, and I think that should be the goal of CPD. So if we think about agency as the knowledge to think critically and to solve challenging problems in context, And as these research papers suggest, it's informed by a sense of purpose and value in your work as a teacher. And teaching is full of persistent problems, and I am under pressure with this slide because I've seen this morning that Jen Barker is in the audience, so if I say anything wrong or sort of like present this in the wrong way, she can like do those motions at me from the second row. I think this is a really a phenomenal piece of work actually that's really helped me to understand some really difficult things about school improvement. Sort of three things that Jen and Tom Rees say define a persistent problem. They're universal, they're causal, and they're controllable. So they're things that all teachers are going to struggle with, they're going to find challenging, they're going to happen whatever context you're in. But if we focus on them and we tackle them effectively, they'll have a strong impact on outcomes. But there are also things we've got a high degree of control over, so it's worth putting our time and our resources into those things. So to develop agency, as that previous definition suggests, teachers need the knowledge, they need fluency, they need to gain fluency in the application of that knowledge, and they need to be able to think critically in the context of their own classrooms. So their ability to exercise that agency is born from that knowledge, that understanding and that thinking. And it requires structure, for sure, and it requires scaffolding, especially in the early years of teaching, but we do have to think about how we gradually withdraw those scaffolds as teachers become more expert. So CPD, I think, has to provide opportunities to acquire knowledge and to apply it, and to think critically with it as well. And as Daniel Letvin says, we need to continually update that knowledge. So CPD has to be sustained. It can't be episodic. So a complex problem, for example, like one I have all the time, my students are struggling to write at length. That will be a multifaceted problem. It will manifest in multiple ways. Letting teachers just go off and try anything they like is not going to work, but neither is mandating kind of one-size-fits-all approaches. There's not going to be a simple solution. There's not going to be one finite body of knowledge that's going to help teachers to address that. But neither is there going to be one set of codified strategies that are going to work for every child in every classroom and every teacher. It's going to need a multi-pronged approach so that teachers can understand the theory and the evidence around how children learn to write. They're going to need time to think. They're going to need time to explore that knowledge, time to practice, discuss, try things out in the classroom, sense make, reflect. All of this is required to develop robust mental models. Now that is a really hard balance to achieve, particularly in the context that we touched on at the beginning. But maybe the pendulum has kind of swung too far in some ways. More structured approaches to teaching and to teacher training have been born from really good intentions, and there's loads of positive things. But we have to be careful, I think, that some of the things that we're doing to attract new teachers to the profession don't have unintended consequences for keeping the ones that we already have. So the good stuff that's happening in CPD, the ECF, for example, is a really brilliant attempt, I think, to create a coherent curriculum for new teachers. Clearly much better than my early experiences, but and Andy touched on this morning, I think we have to be really mindful that what's good for ECTs isn't necessarily good for everyone. So approaches to mentoring and coaching, for example, are going to require, as Andy said, it's like we're really in sync here, careful adaptation for more experienced teachers. And the ideal, of course, is meeting individual need, the same as in the classroom. And that pendulum of structure and autonomy can easily swing too far towards structure, as I've said, particularly perhaps in schools that are really challenging, where there's that need to get that consistency. And yes, where things aren't working, we are going to have to structure things really carefully, but we can't apply blanket approaches. And we also, of course, need to pay attention to what is working, not just focus on the things that aren't. So I think it's really important when we ask the question, are the CPD approaches that we're using, the question I think is, are they really creating thinking professionals, ones who are moving towards greater agency over time? And as the research that I quoted earlier makes clear, agency is based on the ability to think critically. So we want thinking professionals because ultimately, of course, we want thinking students in our classrooms. And Martin Luther King says, of course, that the purpose of education is thinking. And I think that should apply as much to teacher education as it does to the education of children. I think one place that we're really seeing this tension play out is in curriculum. Now, thankfully, the conversation has evolved significantly since my early experiences. There are some really good impacts in schools of the focus that we're placing on curriculum right now. But I think, like all things in education, it's vulnerable to lethal mutations, isn't it? And I worry that our kind of fear of accountability weighs heavily at the moment on how we're planning and delivering that curriculum in our schools. In my work with schools, and I still do quite a bit of work with schools across the country, particularly in English departments, I've seen examples of teachers where they're being asked to deliver centralised curricula that's been brought in, and they've had no involvement in creating, but worse, they've got had no involvement in adapting, and they're just kind of given it, and they call it teach by PowerPoint. That's kind of the description that's used, depressingly. So planning all your own lessons from scratch, like I was doing, clearly not the answer. But I would also argue it's pretty de-skilling and disempowering as a professional, an experienced professional, when you're asked to teach and deliver a pre-planned curriculum when you know the quality of that could be better if you and your team had been given the time and the resources to develop a version that's right for your school and for your kids. It's often said the teacher is the curriculum. Can't remember who said that. Was it Dylan Williams? Somebody like that, probably him. He says all the good stuff, doesn't he? But that doesn't mean giving the teacher a set of PowerPoints, of course, and just expecting them to teach it. It means that curriculum development is also teacher development, because the collaborative work involved is, I think, the highest form of professional learning. And when instead of that, you're asked to deliver, pre-planned slides, and this is what happened to me, that I saw as reductive of my subject, know this, kind of do this. I think that's a surefire way to make teachers feel completely disconnected from their subject, and asking themselves, as I did, is this a profession that I really want to stay in? And in a recent Twitter interaction, sorry to cite my own tweet here, who I really want to cite is Caroline, I saw this described as promoting a kind of intellectual emptiness for some teachers. That was kind of Caroline's phrase I thought was really interesting, and it resonated with how I felt in the latter years of my career, and it's one of the reasons that I eventually sought that intellectual stimulation outside of the classroom. And research suggests that when teachers are denied the intellectual engagement that comes from the deep curriculum work, we're actually taking away one of the motivating factors that brings them to teaching and keeps them in the profession. Now, that is not to say, of course, excuse me, that a centralised curriculum is never the right approach, because we've also got significant issues with workload, and that's one of the reasons that's driving those stats that I shared at the beginning. We've got to be really mindful of that. But it can also be really hard to deliver lessons that are planned by somebody else. Even where that curriculum is really highly resourced and really good quality, we still have to give teachers the time to work with it, to understand it, and to adapt it, and then eventually to review it and refine it. It doesn't get rid of the need for teachers to work collaboratively together. So it might feel contentious to say so, but I think in schools where they don't prioritise that time for teachers to work meaningfully together, to adapt the curriculum, to develop them as specialists, I see that as a failure of leadership, I guess. And probably for me, the most important thing school leaders need to do is to strip everything back in a school to make time for teachers to do that really important work. Many teachers will find it really easy to buy in and focus on that work because it's purposeful, it's collaborative, it's intellectually rewarding, and it gives them agency. And it's the kind of work I think that motivated many of us to become teachers in the first place, and what makes us want to stay. So it's clear then that we need to prioritise the kinds of CPD that help teachers develop agency, and we need to give them time to do it. So what's stopping us? It's dead easy, right? We could all just be doing this. Now, as I've said already, and you will know, we work in a system of high accountability, and often that's at odds with teacher agency. The big challenge, of course, is we need the impact of CPD to be big, and we need it to often to be immediate, whereas building teacher agency takes time. It's a slower burner. So where we take shortcuts, it's not usually because we want to, but because of the stress and the pressure to meet the metrics of success. And we've got lots of these in education, haven't we? The way that schools are held accountable, I think, can lead to us being drawn to short-term sticking plaster solutions, which help us to demonstrate we're meeting metrics. So a lot of curriculum documentation, for example, can look great on paper, whereas creating time for teachers to work collaboratively together so they've got some agency over it is more complex and it's more difficult. So there's often that tension between a need for creativity, critical thinking and teacher agency, and the need for timelines and structure. Agency with no bounds can just lead to coasting, with no impetus for change, but at the other end, too much structure can lead to too much focus on what we're doing, not how we're doing it or why we're doing it, I think. So we need to create the time and the conditions for agency. Time for teachers to explore, for them to learn, and a constrained system where we try and structure and control too much only allows for a fixed number of things, whereas adaptive teaching and leadership, I think, requires that critical thinking. So how can we make it happen? What is the magic answer? How can we improve the amount of agency that teachers have within this system of accountability that we've got and all the things that we can't control in that? I think that we need to build this with intentionality. It can't happen by accident, for sure. So if we take an example of PD that can be a tool for teacher agency that Andy's talked about this morning, which is coaching, that is a form of PD which is really well evidenced. It's got potential, well, Andy might argue with me about that over lunch, there's some evidence, and has potential to improve the quality of teaching in our schools. There's decades of research behind it. At its heart, coaching is a dialogue. The purpose of it is to help teachers reflect on their practice, to improve, guided by their coach. It should be a space where they can think critically, I think. But one of the things I think is happening, and that I see happening in some schools, is we're trying to speed that up because developing agency takes time. Sometimes we try and fast track things and we try and scale them up before we even know whether they're actually working. And coaching won't work and curriculum development won't work if we don't work, I think, to create cultures of thinking in our schools. We'll get compliance, we'll get performance, but we won't get genuine engagement. We'll get initiative fatigue, and then teachers will look to leave. Even within a context that's difficult, because some of the challenges that I've outlined, I think there are opportunities for us to do things better and to do them more carefully. And there are schools where staff stay, where they keep getting better. So the ambition phrase there, it's never left me, keep getting better. You'll be familiar with this study from Kraft and Pape, which shows that when we create the conditions for professional learning and development, teachers do improve over time. But we can't just tinker around the edges of teacher agency. I don't think we have to create those conditions in the right way. We can't, there's no point telling teachers they've got choice, they've got agency, and then doing the opposite. We can't say, you know, go back to your classroom, use your professional judgment, use your agency, if then somebody from SLT in a fancy high-vis jacket is in your lesson the next day, ticking things off on a clipboard. People always laugh, and I say, that's a bit familiar. For professional growth, the culture has to be right, of course, and if there's no professional trust, it's not going to work. Teachers need to feel they're being supported, not judged. So genuine improvement, I think, comes from CPD that develops and allows agency. And the collaboration of colleagues working together. So how do we do it? Well, we haven't got a perfect system and we haven't got perfect solutions, but we can be clear about the challenge and the evidence, and we can do things with intentionality. So the trust I work for is the Greater Manchester Education Trust. We've got 4 secondary schools in our trust, all located within a few miles of each other. But despite our geographical proximity, our schools have really different contexts. So we've got two all-girls schools that serve predominantly Muslim students. We've got 2 schools that have got absolutely enormous sixth forms. We've got 1 school that's in the top 1% of deprivation indicators in East Manchester. We've got getting on for 80% pupil premium, and that school's recently come out of measures. So the context of these schools and the student populations they serve is really different, which means that CPD, of course, needs to look different across our schools, but it also needs to look different, I think, within our schools. We can't assume that just because of an Ofsted grade or a certain marker of a school, that means that everybody kind of needs the same approach. So we're working to develop 3 things in our trust. We're a new trust. We've only just started. This is going to take us time. We're not going to get it all right. But for us, the first thing that we're focusing on is building our culture intentionally around this idea of teacher agency. And this is going to underpin everything that we do, because we want our staff to thrive, we want them to stay in their classrooms. So we need to be really clear about the kind of professional culture that we are trying to build. So our first step to that is we're currently working on a series of charters that we're developing, we will be developing collaboratively with staff to decide on the principles that we are all going to align around. So for example, one of those is going to be responsiveness. So as a trust, we're going to agree that this is an important principle of CPD, but there's going to be flex for schools to implement that in the way that they see fit. And to build our culture, we need to think about our values and living those intentionally and being clear what they look like. I won't sort of labour this point, but this is kind of one example of our trust values down the left-hand side here: excellence, care and respect. And this is an example of a framework that we're developing for coaches to use in coaching interactions, which guides them on, if we're going to really say we think respect is an important value in our trust, what could that look like in a coaching interaction? So that is a way that we are, and I can share that afterwards if anybody's interested. That's how we're thinking about culture. And then secondly, we're trying to deliberately create spaces for dialogue and collaboration and reflection and critical thinking. And that's why we've invested in Iris Connect across our trust. We chose to work with Iris because it meets teachers where they're at in their development need. And it's helping us to create those spaces for that dialogue and reflection. We're quite new to this, but if you want to hear about how it's going, Rachel and Amy from one of the schools in our trust are here today. They are doing some amazing work around this, thinking really carefully about how to build that culture. It's absolutely not right, FD, we've got Iris now, you're all using it tomorrow. They will tell you it doesn't work like that. You've really got to create the conditions for staff to engage with it. And then finally, I think the logistics we're focusing on. We are trying to show value. We are showing value for teachers and their development and developing their agency through the time and the resources that we're trying to give them. So we've done some things like we've worked on our timetable this year so that all our mentor training, our ECT training and our subject communities and some other things, MPQ time, is all going to come during the school day. Now to do that, we've had to strip a lot of stuff away. We've had to get rid of a lot of nonsense and other things. But I think that's how we show teachers that we value their development and how they're going to work towards greater agency. So closing words. I think I will end on this with my sort of call to action. I think there are lots of things in schools right now that we can't control. We've got the system of high accountability. Within that, then, what can we control? As Andy said, I think right now is a turning point for teacher development, or Andy called it an inflection point. There's more focus than ever before on it, but I think we've got to grasp that wave and have the bravery to sort of define it and to shape it. And if we see school improvement as a vehicle to develop our teachers and develop our people, we will keep more of them in the profession, I think. And I think that opportunities and cultures for thinking and critical thinking are where that is going to be bred. Some of the sort of biggest learning points, and it might be the same for you, and the highlights of my professional career were, and still are, conversations with other colleagues. Sometimes that's formal, structured ways. Sometimes that's just where you're making a cup of tea, if you ever get time in a school to do that, and you have that kind of conversation. So I think we can create and we can be part of cultures in schools that empower teachers as professionals. We can value teacher voice genuinely. We can listen. We can make brave decisions in our schools that help teachers to have time to work on their development by stripping away a lot of the nonsense that drains their time and energy. And we can balance some of those quick wins with some of the longer term aims of developing agency. And as teachers leave the profession and our children need them more than ever before, I think those of us in the room with the responsibility for teacher learning and teacher development need to do that. And spaces today that we are lucky to have for collaboration and discussion are key to that. These spaces for kind of thinking and sharing are so important. So if you're working in schools, well done to your schools for letting you out to come here today, because it shows that they're valuing that, they're valuing your professional learning, and engaging in the kinds of critical thinking and debate that we'll have here today will ultimately enrich our profession. So I'd say when you go back to your schools, when you go back to your organisations after you've spent the day here, recall those moments today where you hear a new idea and it sparks a kind of a connection in you, and it helps you think about new ways to do something that you've been struggling with. And just recall sort of how inspired you felt in that moment and how motivated it makes you feel to want to learn more and to do more and to talk to somebody else about what you're thinking. And then take that learning back to your schools, and I think commit to being part of that solution by working to create those spaces in your own schools and your own trusts where teachers are empowered to have agency in their classrooms, because they're learning all the time and they're growing as professionals and they feel valued and they want to stay in our schools, and our young people need them and they will get the benefit. We need, therefore, to keep great teachers in our schools. We need to give them agency. We need to build cultures of intellectual curiosity and dialogue. And that's about professional generosity. It's about how we share ideas and resources. It's about not competing between schools, but reaching out to have that dialogue across the sector, because we care about all our teachers and all our children in our society, not just the ones in our schools. So I'll leave you with this thought from today. What are you going to take away? What are you going to get from this event that's going to help you to grow as a professional? But even more importantly, what will you share and what will you give back? Thank you very much.